So our next presenter is obviously no stranger to NSGIC, Mr. Bill Johnson, currently with AppGeo, formerly New York State GIO, and here to tell us about the secret sauce of collaboration. And if I say much more about that, it won't be a secret, right? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. All right. Is the audio, everything good? Okay. Let's just get right into this. So I want to start with a little bit of preface so you know what to expect here. This presentation is not about an epiphany. It's not about some brand new idea. And in fact, it's a little bit ironic that it's in an innovation summit, because what I'm going to talk to you about are some really old ideas that I think you're going to recognize. What might be a little different is the packaging of these ideas into a framework that we call federation. And maybe it'll give you a little different way of thinking about some of these things. So these are going to be observations that I've gleaned over partly from my years as the GIO for the state of New York. And then in the last 4 years, project work I've been doing at AppGeo, strategic project work in a number of states that have helped me gain some more clarity, more insights that you're going to see now in this presentation. So just to give you a heads up of what to expect, I'm going to cover a little bit of like, what are we talking about with federation? What does that mean? And how does it work with enterprise data projects? And we'll illustrate that with an example or two. And from there, we're going to pivot to trying to unpack federation. How and why does it work? What are the characteristics of it that make it work? And then I want to take those ideas and extend them into some of the other things that a GIO does or probably should do, if I were to be honest about my opinion. And then finally, I want to challenge you to think about how these ideas might apply to your work as a GIS leader. So how does that sound? Good. All right, let's get into it. I love toys, and you'll see I have Tinker Toys up here on the stage with me. Toys, these toys like Tinker Toys, Legos, Lincoln Logs, and Erector Set, what they allow you to do is be creative and explore, but at a simplified level where you're not bogged down with details. And that's what we want to talk about with these models for how collaboration can work. So I'm trying to break it down into some simple components, things like partnerships, policies, roles, and governance. Those are the model pieces that you assemble like Tinker Toys. And you're already assembling them, but perhaps you're not thinking about, are there other ways to put these pieces together? And what are the impacts when you assemble them in those different ways that might work to your advantage or not, depending on how you configure it? So that's what this is about. We're going to take these Tinker Toy models. Again, partnerships, policies, roles, governance are the key pieces we're going to talk about and see if they'll apply to you for making partnerships work more effectively. Now, if you were at the annual in September, my AppGeo colleague, Kate Hickey over here, she and I did a on-demand presentation where we presented these ideas. And then she and I followed up with 2 webinars, one in November and one in December, where we went a little deeper and broke down the centralized and decentralized in November and then the federated in December. So if you saw any of those, these next couple of slides are repetition, and I apologize for that, but I'm assuming not everyone has seen those. So look at these diagrams and pay attention to the dark blue. The navy blue represents the points on these diagrams where authority and decision-making take place. And then the green are other partners who are not in the decision-making role. So we're going to start over on the left, the decentralized model. And with my Tinker Toys here, the decentralized one, I think we can think of as loose pieces. These are all stakeholders, but they're not connected. They're each working independently. And that doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. What it means is they're working to meet their own requirements, but they're doing it solo. And in government, this happens most frequently when there are adequate resources for them to do that work and meet those needs without outside help. And that can sometimes make it hard to break that because there's inertia and momentum around these programs once they're installed. And one of the lessons from government is that inertia, which I define as doing the same thing tomorrow that you did yesterday, that can be a pretty powerful force in government, because I think I'm seeing some nods out here that you understand what I'm talking about. So let's shift to the other end of this slide over on the right-hand side where we've got centralized. The centralized is probably much more common for you. Oh, by the way, did I say on decentralized that I define that as the absence of coordination? If I didn't say that, I want to make sure that plant that. That's my concept of decentralized is what happens by default if we don't have, if you as a GIS leader are not active in trying to get this collaboration going, your probably default position is a decentralized. We flip over to the centralized side. Now we're in more of a hierarchical mode. And here we have decisions being made at the top, at the state GIS office on behalf of the other participants in the enterprise. And so that doesn't mean it's wrong. What it means is there's a concentration of that decision-making at the top of that pyramid. And we see this very often. It's kind of the default structure for doing collaborative work. And you're going to see that coming in some more of the examples that we're going to talk about. And often it's implemented with what we might call a carrot and a stick approach, where the carrot might be that there's new state funding available. The GIO is able to tap and share that with a network of partners. And the stick is the compliance thing that the GIO would need to enforce with the threat of lost funding if we're not in compliance. So that's kind of how carrot and stick works in the centralized model. Now this thing in the middle that we're calling federated is a bit of a blend of both. And you can see that the dark blue, remember that's where the authority and the decision-making takes place. You see that happening on every part of that diagram. It's because it's a shared authority model. And we're going to explain that in more detail, but just think of it as something partway in between centralized and decentralized for the moment. Now, bear in mind, this is all a continuum. There are very few pure examples of purely centralized or purely decentralized. Very often what we see are characteristics that map somewhere along this line. So you might have a centralized activity that you've got some elements of federation in there, and that would move you a little bit toward the middle in this diagram and so forth. So just bear in mind that we're not thinking in terms of purity. It's just a way of arranging the model pieces that get you certain outcomes. So I guess I have to start with, we got to define federation. It's one of those fuzzy terms to a lot of people. I imagine if I asked 10 of you to define federation, we'd probably get 10 fairly different answers. The one I put on this slide is the definition you get if you Google define federation. I'm going to read it for you because I like it. It's an adjective meaning of a country or organization set up as a single and centralized unit within which each state or division keeps some internal autonomy. That is the key right there. It is an authority sharing, an autonomy sharing, a power sharing structure. And, in the natural world, we don't often see that. What we see in the natural world is competition that creates winners that rise to the top and losers. And authority structures in the natural world tend to be hierarchical. Think about a beehive, you got a single queen. The wolf pack has an alpha male. The elephant herd has an elder matriarch female that's leading the herd and so forth. And in our societal structures, we see these all over the place. Think about the way the military hierarchy works, or think about the Roman Catholic Church, or any corporation that comes to the top with a CEO at the top that concentrates that authority at the top of the pyramid. The one I have on the slide here, on the right-hand side of the slide, shows a kingdom with peasants at the bottom. You probably can't read that, but there's peasants at the bottom and a king at the top. Again, this is very kind of a common structure. Now, the founding fathers of this country had just fought to separate themselves from a monarchy where power was concentrated at the top. And they set up this federal government, this federated model that we have in the US, where they spread the power out among 3 branches of government. So we didn't have a single point at the top. And then they also federated authority out to the states. So states can pass their own laws. And that's the kind of a power sharing structure that we have. It's really not, it's not typical in the way many of the things in our world that we see on a day-to-day basis work. So let's talk about how this works in the context of enterprise data projects. And this is what we talked about in our on-demand presentation back in September, and the 2 webinars Kate and I did were all about enterprise data projects, the kinds of things that a GIO would lead to cause the creation and active maintenance and governance around something like a state address database or a parcel database or an imagery layer for your state. And the key thing here is that authority sharing has to work through carefully defined roles. So the governance model that makes this work is more about the roles and making sure they're all parsed out correctly than any other element of it. So let me just give you a kind of a typical situation. We might be talking about, for example, to build a state address layer. Well, addressing is a local government function. Those addresses originate as an artifact of, or the record is an artifact of a function that local government is obligated to perform. So as the land is subdivided and developed, addresses are assigned. So if we have a federated model for creating this layer, we're going to want to make sure that that local entity that creates the addresses has a defined active ownership role in that process to bring it together. So rather than just asking them to give it up and let it disappear into a centralized structure where they don't see it again, they're no longer the authority on it. In an enterprise federated model, that entity retains control. So they are the one making decisions about what happens to that record, how it lives in the enterprise system, who's got the ability to change it, would stay at the local authority. And the way that works is that in the leadership model, there has to be a collaborative effort around all these stakeholders to get agreed upon standards and a policy framework. And then generally also a technology framework that makes it easy for those pieces to roll up into a single database with the right roles and responsibilities assigned to that, so it can be shared out. So that's what we're talking about in the world of enterprise data projects. Now, I want to pause here for a minute just to be clear that I'm not talking about the software technology framework as the driver for this. And we have lots of good vendors, and a number of NSGIC sponsors offer software that can be configured to support a federated data project. Oftentimes that very same software can also be configured to support a centralized configuration as well. So you, as the buyer, as the owner of that solution, have a lot of decisions to make about how the roles are doled out. And in doing that, you are, like it or not, making a lot of decisions about whether you're federating or centralizing the way that process is going to work. But bear in mind, again, that even if you set up the roles in a nice federated model, that's not a federated solution. That's a piece of a federated solution. That's the technology piece of it. So I'm talking about an abstraction that's a layer above this. This should be familiar to you. These are the agreed upon framework data layers that we all consider the basis, the base map upon which all of our other GIS applications are built. And if we looked at each of these layers individually and thought about what is the right model, how much centralization or how much federation is relevant for each of these, we would see that there's significant differences among these 8 about what makes the most sense. For example, the imagery and the elevation data are generally acquired under a contract. You're either going to contract for it to be collected and delivered to you as a product, or you're going to license it because it's already been collected and is available under a license. It's not data that originates from your stakeholders like addresses do, where they are generated as a local government record. So in these 2 framework layers, what we're talking about is the state harnessing the buying power of the whole state to get the economies of scale that will give you lower cost per square mile to produce these data layers. So it's a very, very centralized model that's very relevant for these 2 layers. Now, you might have a little bit of a footnote on here where you say, well, yeah, but I've got a buy up option. My local partners can buy up and get higher resolution. That's great. And that's an element of federation that moves you on the slider a little bit toward the center. But in the main, these 2 are going to be highly appropriate for a centralized approach. Let's consider parcels and addresses. These are layers where the data originates as a function of local government. You know, the parcel data is something that local governments have to do as land is sold and transferred, and it has to be valued and assessed for taxation. And so those records originate and are maintained actively at the local level. Likewise, we already talked about for addresses. So these lend themselves to federation. They can be done in a centralized approach too. But as you're going to see when we go a little deeper into this, I believe a federated model has some major advantages over a centralized approach on these two layers. But again, we could go through the rest of these and we would see that they probably have a bit of a blend in what's appropriate. But you need to think about each data project requires a fresh set of thinking about how do I arrange my tinker toy pieces on policies, partnerships, governance, and roles to make it most effective for that layer. So let's talk about a real example. If you saw the December webinar, we had Ken Nelson, who's the GIO for Kansas and is a NSGIC board member. You see him on the bottom of the screen there, and his close colleague, Eileen Battles. And they have spent a decade establishing a very robust federated model for the management of the GIS data to support NextGen 911 for the state of Kansas. I also have, you're probably wondering why the heck I have Ted Lasso on there. And that is because if you are a fan of that Apple TV series, and I am, the character, Ted Lasso, originates from Kansas in that series, even though he's in Britain. And in real life, Jason Sudeikis grew up in Kansas and went to the high school next to the one where Ken and Eileen both went. So he's kind of the hometown hero, but I digress. So let's talk about what they're doing in their federated model here. So in Kansas, the layers they need for next-gen call routing, you should be able to recite these with me. PSAP boundaries, provisioning boundaries, road center lines, emergency service boundaries, site structure address points. Those layers are all being actively built and maintained by the PSAPs. In Kansas, the PSAPs are primarily aligned to the counties like they are in a lot of other states. So the map you see here is a PSAP map of the state. And under their federated model, those layers, the editing on those layers occurs at the PSAP level. So all the maintenance happens by the PSAPs. Many of those PSAPs are in very rural areas. The PSAP staff is very small. They use a contractor to do that work on their behalf. But that doesn't change the fundamental role. The fact that a contractor is doing the work on their behalf is not a change in the federated model. And then what Ken and Eileen have is an enterprise database at the Kansas Geological Survey, where the state GIO is housed at the university, by the way. And that data rolls up in a standard that all of the PSAPs collaborated on to develop for the state and agreed to adopt. And it's loaded up into this enterprise database where it's run against all the QC checks to make sure that it complies with that agreed upon standard. So there's a value add happening. Now everybody's data is consistently checked against the standard and is all edge matched and seamless. So we get that quality data. And from there, that data is then provisioned into the actual 911 systems, of which there are 4 in Kansas, but they all live off the data coming from a single enterprise database. So there's a hosted solution that most of the PSAPs in the state siphon the data into, and then there are 3 others that are in use, but they all operate on the same way. So we have all the key ingredients here. We have local control and autonomy on the data. We have agreed upon policies and standards, that statewide framework that makes it work. We have an enterprise database. We have consistent QA, so we have a quality data set that is then uniformly provisioned out to a diversity of systems. And so bravo, Kansas, this is how it works. We're going to pivot now and talk about what are these characteristics of federation that I think are the secret sauce here. And I start with deliberately wording this willful participation, because in federation, you're not using top-down authority. We do not compel participation in a federated approach, which makes this, it's on one dimension, it's probably the most important characteristic of federation. And if we look at the other side of that coin, it's also one of the most challenging aspects to overcome, because how do you get all that willful participation? And, you know, what you don't want is to conclude that I can't start until I have 100% agreed upon participation. If you do that, you're virtually guaranteed to never start. And here's why. There is a natural and predictable timeline about how this adoption will work. You will start with what we might call a coalition of the willing, or the early adopters is another name for that. There's going to be a few people in every classroom when you ask them if they want in, they're going to raise their hand. Those are your early adopters. You get things going with them. Then others who were on the fence will look and see, hey, that appears to be working, and will join in. And success breeds success, and you start to get some momentum, and more people join in. And then after a little while, you reach a critical tipping point where the number of people in exceeds the number of people out. And that's a great thing, because that creates another incentive, because nobody wants to be on the losing side. And they start looking around and realizing, many of their friends and neighbors have made that jump. So it gives them another motivation to want to flip their position. And finally, you get the last holdouts who eventually have to concede. If they look around and they're the only hand left in the classroom that isn't raised, they can't be right and everybody else wrong. And they eventually will join in as well. So that's why it's fine to start with a partial set and build from there in this willful participation idea. Now, again, because it's voluntary, it's opt-in, how do you make it attractive? So you really need to put yourself in the shoes of these stakeholders and ask yourself the hard questions about what's in it for them, how do I make it attractive? But actually, even more important than how to make it attractive is think about the obstacles. We might call it friction or barriers or blockers or hurdles. There's a lot of ways to describe it, but there's lots of evidence that kind of proves that the negative factors that prevent a yes actually have a stronger impact on your decision than the enticements of saying yes. So you really need to give a lot of thought to and have answers to your potential stakeholders that address these issues to help them make the right decision and come on board. Now I've labeled this one participants retain control, but I want to cast that a little differently. I want to call this being a driver versus being a passenger. And I have no better example of this than there was a wonderful movie that came out a couple of years ago called Ford versus Ferrari. How many of you saw that? I loved that movie. And more surprisingly, my wife loved that movie too. She thought it was going to be a car flick, and it's way more than a car flick. But there's a scene in that movie, and for those of you who haven't seen it, Carroll Shelby, played by Matt Damon on the left here in this scene, is taking the CEO of the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford II, out for a test drive in this race car that they built to take on Ferrari at the 1966 Le Mans race. And Mr. Ford practically soils himself in terror as they whip around the Ford proving grounds at high speed, skidding around. So it's a little bit of a dramatic thing, but I think it's important. When you use a federated model, you're creating drivers. When you use a hierarchical approach, you're creating passengers. And there's a big difference. How do you feel in the car when you have your hand on the wheel versus sitting here while Carroll Shelby tears around the test track? Now, we talked a little bit about role clarity, and I love theater as a metaphor for understanding this. You see a playbill on the screen. You might not be able to read that fully, but you see at the top of the playbill, it lists the cast and the director, the people you see in that play. But then further down, it lists all the production staff, the sound designer, the set designer. There's one listed there for master electrician. Really? Who knew? But the point is, there's a lot of roles to figure out in an enterprise model. And you need to carefully define all of those roles. And you need to fill all of those roles for your production to be successful. Now, I don't know about you, but the biggest purchase I've made in my lifetime was buying our home. That's probably the biggest purchase you will make. And I can clearly remember my wife and I sitting in an attorney's office at the real estate closing, and signing a lot of documents and writing a bunch of checks. And at the end of it, our name was on a deed. And I remember the rush of pride over that transaction. And I remember how differently I felt about being a homeowner. I felt so different than I felt about the apartment that we were moving out of. I imagine it's the same for you, because when you own something, you care about it. You take care of it. You're going to want to improve it so you can enjoy it even more. And that's what happens in federation. You're giving each of your stakeholders, each of your partners, a small ownership piece. So they have their name on a deed, and they are bought in, and they are going to care more, and they are going to contribute in a more meaningful way than if they were a renter as opposed to an owner. You know, you often hear about win-win. Well, in the natural order of things, there's mostly win and lose. There's a lot of competition out there. But what federation does is it creates something I'm going to call a shared win, where you and all of these stakeholders that you engage in this federated model all share in the win. So instead of a win-lose or a win-win, in federation, it's actually a win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win, ... And then, of course, this is another one I really like. The sum is greater than the parts. Now, airplanes consist of a lot of parts, but the big pieces are mainly chunks of aluminum or carbon fiber. It's only when you put all those pieces of aluminum and carbon fiber together that you can freaking fly through the sky. Oh my God. I mean, does that happen any other way? Pardon me, I'm being a little overly dramatic, but the point is valid. Each of those partners gets to fly on that airplane. They get more than the sum of the parts. With the same level of effort that they would have had working solo, they're on the plane. If they put the same level of effort into working solo, at the end of the day, they might have a piece of a wing or a flap or a landing gear or something, but no flight. And I think that's pretty cool. So we talked about understanding what federation is and what are these characteristics of it on how it works. So let's see if we can extend these ideas into some of the other things that I think are relevant for a GIO or a GIS leader. And I spent tens and tens of seconds searching Google Images for images of extension pole window washers and extension pole tree trimmers, because I clearly recall how important those two use cases are for a GIO. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is this understanding the dynamic of how an effective relationship that binds a GIO and an advisory council and the stakeholder community. And this has come more into focus in the last few years since I've been with AppGeo, because I'm now able to think about the experience I had in New York and see how that applies, see what the similarities and differences are in a bunch of other states where we've been doing these strategic projects. And so I've got a lot more clarity now than I had a few years ago about this. So on the left is kind of a traditional hierarchical approach to how it often works, and how it worked in a lot of cases in New York as well, where the GIO has ideas about programs to implement around the state, data programs and other things, data sharing, clearinghouse, and all kinds of related activities, and generally takes those ideas to an advisory council, has the advisory council give he or she feedback and advice on it. And then those programs are then deployed out to the stakeholders who are the beneficiaries. They're the bottom layer of this pyramid. But in this hierarchical approach, which again, I think is quite common, the flow is mostly top down, and the stakeholders at the bottom don't have a ton of say in how that works. They are the recipients of the largesse bestowed upon them through the goodness of the state and its GIO and advisory council, right? But how about if we implemented some of these federation concepts that we're talking about? Give each of these members of your coordinating council, give each of your stakeholders an appropriate role, a well-defined role that embodies some ownership and some stake and some autonomy in how those roles are going to work. And suddenly what happens is those relationships tighten up and the flow becomes less top down and more bidirectional. And you suddenly have a better, more robust, more bought in body of cooperation. And here's how it might play out. Now, we already talked about those 8 framework layers. When we put them all in one bucket, that becomes the basis of a state spatial data infrastructure, or state SDI. And so now we have another layer. We already talked about each of those layers, each of those 8 layers has a certain combination of how you put those tinker toy pieces together that's going to be most effective. But when we have it all together and we're thinking of it as an integrated SDI, and by the way, I put a lot of states have kind of created an identity around doing that, and I've put 3 of them on the screen, but apologies to many more of you that have done similar work, and I didn't take the time or trouble to find all the logos I could and add them on here, but it's a common approach. But when you think about how this comes together, there now has to be a set of governance around that integrated set so that it's available together, it fits together, it's edge matched, it's the policies around who can access it and how it's used are consistent. And think about this for a minute. Isn't this another use case where having clearly defined roles, we're allowing ownership of certain pieces of that come into play? This is another place where a federated approach to that management of SDI, to me, makes a ton of sense. Now, some of you may follow the blogs I write periodically, and I wrote one last March on this idea of blended data. And I had this image in here. That image is where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together at Cairo, Illinois. And if you look down near the bottom, I've blown that up. You can see that the 2 flows where they come together, they remain a bit distinct. And I think this is a nice metaphor for blending of public data and commercial or licensed data in your GIS applications, which we're going to see more and more. It's already happening, and we're going to see more of that. So they're actually now flowing together in the same channel, moving downstream together, supporting the same river traffic, if you will, those applications. If we looked 2 miles downstream, the separation between those layers has probably mostly disappeared. But okay, enough on the river flow metaphor. The concept of how this works. We heard Cy yesterday talking about the work they want to do with some pilot projects at NSGIC and FGDC, including the idea of public-private partnerships, or P3. And I think that's a noble idea. But I also think there are some pretty steep challenges with doing that. And let me explain what I mean, because I'm going to offer another way to think about how to do this blending. When you think about a public-private partnership, the concept is fairly simple. The public entity has something to share with the private entity, and the private entity has something to share, and the result is goodness that can be spread around for everyone to reap the benefit of. Great concept. What it actually is a value exchange. And there are some things you have to think about on both sides of that value exchange. On one side, on the public sector side, it's often not possible for a government agency to give something of value to a single commercial entity. It's either a public record or it's not a public record. You can't be selective about a record and say it's only available to Acme partners and not to the others. And if we think about the value exchange on the other side, what the commercial entity is going to have to do is make some business decisions about what they're willing to share. And they might be thinking about things like, what revenue would I be potentially losing? Or how does this impact my position in certain vertical markets like transportation, public safety, and so on? Or how does this change my positioning relative to the competitors in these markets? And there's a number of other kinds of considerations, but all would be a value consideration that the commercial firm is going to have to weigh. And importantly, the government participant on the other side of the P3 equation is not going to see that value calculation. So they don't have a way to know, is the value exchange fair or is it not fair? Is it balanced? And those market factors that went into the commercial calculation are subject to a lot of market fluctuations, and they're going to change over time. So the idea that you could craft a stable, long-term viable public-private partnership seems to me to be fairly challenging. And I think that's part of why we don't see a ton of them. But if we look at this through the lens of a federated enterprise, where you have these deeply engaged partners, what you might consider doing is looking at this as a purely business deal and look at and engage with your partners on a deeper level to really understand what are their requirements. And don't just ask them, hey, what do you want out of this thing? And you get a checklist that says, I got to have these things, as if it's, that's it, no negotiation. If you have federated partners that you're engaging with on a deeper level, you might understand that, for example, they say, well, we have to be able to make this publicly available for government accountability and transparency purposes. Great. What does that mean? Does it mean the record has to be downloadable? Or was that need satisfied by having a public-facing web application where you can interact with that data and explore and answer your questions about that to address the accountability issues without the record being downloadable? That's just that's a for instance. Once you've understood these requirements at a deeper level, you then have a matrix of what's needed by your different types of partners that can be a contract specification that you can then put out as a competitive procurement. And that's how you're going to know that you're getting an equal value exchange, because the marketplace will compete to give you the best price on those specifications. So it's an alternative way of thinking about it. It's less kumbaya, we're all going to share and do well, and more of a let the natural forces of competition sort this out for you once you've worked with your federated partners to deeply understand the requirements. So hopefully that made sense. Now, I'm going to be intentionally a little bit provocative on this slide. And I gave Cy a heads up last night. I didn't want him jumping out of his chair and getting excited here. But I think there's a real opportunity to make some major improvements in the governance of the national spatial data infrastructure. These concepts are now 30 plus years old. And the structure we have in place in the US is that there's something called the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the FGDC. That's the dark blue box at the top of this diagram that makes all the decisions about the NSGI. That is the authority structure to govern the NSGI. It's a top-down, federal-only decision-making body. Now, they've augmented it with something called the National Geospatial Advisory Council, or NGAC, and that's what you see on the right, hanging off the side cloud there of FGDC. The issue there is that the NGAC is just that. It's purely advisory. They actually have zero authority to do anything. The decisions are still made entirely by the FGDC. So, with apologies, it's a toothless tiger. It's gumming its food. And so I look at this and I see some opportunities for federation. Now, let me just pause and say, the FGDC is working well on, if you think back a few slides ago when we talked about which layers lend themselves to a centralized approach. And you saw that we had imagery and elevation data. Well, that's actually things that we can point to for successes with the FGDC. We have the National Aerial Imagery Program, NAIP, and we have the 3-depth elevation program. Those take advantage of the buying power of the US to get economies of scale. And those are successes. I think we can all agree on that. But the FGDC's top-down centralized structure is not doing so well on some of the other layers. And here is where I think the concepts of federation could play. If you look at that middle layer, that's states, that's us. And we have connections both up into the national programs and down into the local governments that operate in our footprints. So, I'm criticizing the FGDC here, but there's reason for hope. We have the Geospatial Data Act passed 2 years ago, and there's now a fresh look at how to make this successful. And Cy has been keeping us informed about dialogue that's actually happening to modernize the governance around NSGI. And that's a good thing. And it gives me hope. So here's the idea I would like to see debated and considered. I can conceive of a 2-tier federated model working very well in the NSGI, where they federate authority to the states as one tier. And then there's another tier that states federate to their local stakeholders to be much more effective about things like creating a robust national parcel layer and address layer. And I think the pathway to success is open and available to us. And NSGIC, of all organizations, is right at the middle of this diagram. So we could have a strong voice in advocating for something like that. Now, federation doesn't seem to be kind of a natural thing. We don't see power sharing really happening much in the natural world. It's not, and where I'm going with this is, federation isn't going to happen by default. It's not going to happen on its own. You have to be deliberate about it. You have to be thoughtful and purposeful and go and work through some processes and stay with it to make it successful, because it is not the natural way of the world. And I think it comes down to leadership style. Now, I have to apologize. I actually spent a surprising amount of time searching Google Images for something a little more gender and ethnicity and balanced. And all I've come up with for images that were close to appropriate were white males. So if you can look past that and just ask yourself, does my leadership style mirror the one on the left or the one on the right? I think that's a good question to ask yourself. Now, I think we all want to believe that our leadership style mirrors the gentleman on the left. And I certainly want to believe that about myself. But if I were to tell you the whole truth and think back on my time as the New York GIO, there were certainly times where I considered myself the authority figure on GIS issues in the state. I felt it was my responsibility to craft these solutions. And there may have been 1 or 2 days where I actually thought I knew better than some of the other folks. Just saying. So here is where it's really valuable to have a close colleague who's willing to share with you what they observe about your leadership style. Because you may not even realize that you're sending subtle signals about your role as an authority figure versus a partner person. And so having one of those honest colleagues who can give you that feedback can be really valuable in helping tune your posture. I've been really lucky. I've had a couple of those in my career. And so I want to offer a personal thank you to Frank Winters and to Kate Hickey. Now, I started out with Tinker Toys, and I have them up here. I remember we were talking about how to arrange these partners, policies, roles, governance in different ways that impact how your programs work. And I'm trying to keep it simple because that's how my brain works. I need simple. I'm not like Dr. Chen, who was your keynote this morning. I have to let these ideas make a lot of revolutions on the hamster wheel inside my head before they finally sink in. But I've thought about this enough, and I'm realizing there's a bit of a paradox with these federated models. What the heck is he talking about? Well, the paradox is this. By sharing authority, by sharing power, sharing control with your partners, giving away that some of that authority that you have vested in you but by virtue of your role, you actually empower the partnerships and you end up with more powerful solutions. So by giving it away, your power, you create more power. It's a multiplier. And the reverse, I think, is true as well. If you try to consolidate your power at the top of the pyramid, you're putting a damper on those partnerships. You're actually creating passengers, not drivers. You're creating renters, not owners. And the partnerships are not as robust. So by consolidating power, you actually are in a weaker position. So I hope I've given you some new ways to think about some old ideas. Because when I think about this, I get pretty excited about the potential for partnerships through a federated model. Because what federation allows you to do is to work together with your stakeholders on solutions that can do the greatest good for the greatest number of use cases. And isn't that what geospatial coordination is all about? Thank you.